but the first time we met in public was at the Austin Workshop for Test Automation in 2005. And Elizabeth was at the 2003 edition with a guy named Ward Cunningham. You may know that name. I was there in 2005, and Elizabeth and I had a discussion in the Austin airport about beginner's mind and software testing. It stuck with me for ever since that time. But 2 years later, in 2007, I had a job. I was building this really complex automated test client code for a really complex API, and I dropped Elizabeth in the line and said, hey, I'm going to be in the Bay Area for work. You want to just do a little peer conference like the Austin thing for testers who do development and developers who do testing? She said, that's a great idea. Harry Robinson at Google might be interested in that. And he was, and they said, Google would support that. You guys can come down to Mountain View for your little peer conference. And one thing led to another, and 150 developers from around the world descended on Mountain View because I asked Elizabeth this. 2 years after that, 2009, I was writing a lot of articles, and I was getting really tired of the echo chamber in software testing, and I thought we needed some new voices. And I said, Elizabeth, I want to do this peer conference in my hometown in Durango, Colorado. She said, yeah, I'd be on board with that. And thanks to Elizabeth and a number of other people, that happened, and a lot came out of that conference. Among other things, I think the first ever issue of any major software magazine devoted to women in test had probably, I think, 90% contributors that were either at that conference or involved in the wiki and the mailing list, something I'm very proud of. So at the foundation just recently, we've made a lot of investments in testing and exploratory testing. And we just hired our second exploratory tester. We hired Rumana Yasmin a year ago, and she's made such an important contribution that we hired Elena Tonkovich just last week. And my team has been asked to communicate more widely what we do and how we do it. And exploratory testing has become so important. The first person I thought to call was Elizabeth. I'm part of a team called Release Engineering, and we are a service organization. We are 8 people in a field of 150 tech people at the foundation, roughly. And our job is to get code from the developer's head to the production machine as quickly, efficiently, and safely as possible. And that's where QA comes in. There's only 4 of us at the foundation with QA in our title, so it's kind of a historical accident. If you want to think of our exploratory testers as associate product managers, you can do that. If you want to think of our test automators as software developers who work in test automation, you can do that. We like QA. QA is not evil. That is QA at the foundation. And without further ado, Elizabeth Henderson.
Thank you, Chris. I actually had totally forgotten how the Dev Test Dev conference happened. So thank you very much for reminding me. It was a good conference. So I'm the Director of Quality Engineering for Cloud Foundry. Cloud Foundry is an open source PaaS, a platform as a service. I like to say that we shave the yaks so you don't have to. However, that only works if you know the yak shaving story. You all know the phrase yak shaving? Okay, good. I won't tell the story then, unless we have time at the end. But the idea is that as an application developer, you want to worry about your application code. You don't want to have to worry about standing up a Tomcat server or all of the other associated infrastructure-like things that you might have to do to get that thing into production. And especially at the speed that most organizations are running at today, doing the file a ticket to get the ops team to stand up a new thing, and 6 months later you might get your virtual machine on which you can deploy your code. That doesn't work either. So a PaaS is a mechanism by which you can deploy your code. So Cloud Foundry, an open source one. I also work on the commercial side of Cloud Foundry, so we'll talk a little bit more about the size and scope of Cloud Foundry because it's relevant to this talk. As the Director of Quality Engineering, you might think that I direct a bunch of quality engineers, and that's actually not true either. We have 0 people in the rest of the organization with the word quality anywhere in their title. I'm the only one, and that's just because they had to give me a title, and we couldn't actually figure out that Elizabeth at large did not work in the HR system. And so the closest thing was Director of Quality Engineering. We have explorers, and we'll talk more. That's what this whole talk is about, is how we test Cloud Foundry. So we'll talk more about that. Cloud Foundry is massive. It is definitely the biggest project of my entire career. I wrote my first line of code in 1980. I'm totally comfortable with the fact that my code is quite possibly older than you are. That's fine. I'm cool with that. But it is massive, and I've been in this industry a while and seen massive things. I have not seen something quite at this scale before. We have 22 sub-teams across 6 sites. There are 100 plus engineers, and the plus is because it kind of depends on how you count which teams as being in or out of Cloud Foundry at Pivotal, but it's massive number of engineers, 14 dedicated product managers, 4 designers, 5 engineering directors, and I did actually leave it off the list how many explorers, because we kind of count them just as engineers. We actually are down to 1 dedicated explorer. By the way, we're hiring 2. But our 1 dedicated explorer, it looks a little bit different than the rest of the engineers because he rotates through teams more quickly. He will come in and help a team learn how to explore, and within a few weeks then be off to his next team to help them learn how to explore. But we'll, again, talk more about that in a bit. Lots and lots of moving parts. So some of the big moving parts: Bosch, Elastic Runtime, service brokers, multiple command line interfaces, actually, 2, 1 for Bosch, 1 for the Cloud Foundry. And each one of those things then has multiple components. So lots and lots of components and things moving. And then there's even more that's not on that diagram. There's these things called build packs, if anybody's used Heroku, like that, only we have our own forks that we maintain. More services. We've got our commercial side. Our ops manager is a GUI-based installer that wraps Bosch. So massive amounts of stuff. Anybody think I have a small amount of stuff to look after? Okay, good. Tons and tons of code. I used to show the code line counts, and then I realized I counted it wrong, so it was wildly misleading. But over 100 public repos, dozens more private repos that you can't see across like 4 different GitHub organizations, with components written in Ruby, Go, and Java, as well as tons of JavaScript and Bash scripts as well. So lots of stuff. And it runs on 3 different infrastructures. This is an open source thing. You can have your own paths behind your firewall, on your OpenStack cluster, on your vSphere cluster, or you could host it on AWS. And open source, commercial, plus we host our own. Have I convinced you it's massive yet? No? Okay, well, that's fine. But people want to know, how do you test all that? Especially if you don't have anybody with the title quality engineer running around. How on earth do you test all that? Well, let me first tell you all the things that we don't do. We do not write test plans. You will not find giant binders of test plans with test steps and test procedures. We do not run manual regression tests. There is no big team that I'm not telling you about off somewhere else running these things. We do not have an independent QA team. We don't count bugs. We don't have quality metrics targets. So then that leads to, what do we do? I'm assuming that you're here because you actually care about that part, right? Excellent. So the first thing is the product manager's own acceptance. We figure that the best person to tell whether or not they got what they asked for is the person who asked for it. So a lot of organizations that I have talked to in the past, my job used to be get on airplanes, go help people. And usually what I was helping them with was an agile transformation. And they usually called me because they figured out in their agile transformation, they'd gotten to the point where they'd reached the QA department and they found a bunch of people sitting around going, what is this agile thing you speak of? And why are you trying to disturb this? And then they don't know what to do with them. And so then they would call me. And usually they called me saying QA is broken. And usually I would go in and discover that QA was the only functional organization in the entire company. But that's a whole other story from a different life that I don't live anymore. In any case, so in those kinds of organizations, sometimes they would take the QA people and have the QA people do acceptance on behalf of the product manager, only those 2 people weren't necessarily talking, or that set of people were not talking well, communicating well, and so the product manager would ask for something, and then the QA people would be rejecting it based on criteria that the product manager didn't actually want. And so that's a massive amount of churn to put into a system. You are now injecting requirements, which is, by the way, what I built my first part of my career on. And when I realized that I didn't want to manage QA in a traditional org anymore was when I realized that the better I got at my job, the more requirements I was injecting at the end, and the more churn I was causing my organizations, and the more it cost. If I was really good at my job, I could say, what about this? What about that? What about this? And we could go through a whole bunch of scenarios. I would find a whole bunch of bugs. Every single one of those bugs is an assertion about a requirement that should have been in place in the system. And by asserting at the end that this should have been in place, I am now inventing new requirements. And those requirements may or may not actually have been on target for the strategy, the direction that the product organization wanted this thing to go. So putting QA in charge of acceptance basically creates that vector for let's insert a whole bunch of requirements by taking the product manager and saying, dear product manager, you're going to think about strategy, but you're also going to think about tactics, and you're also going to be thinking about how are you going to know that you got what you asked for? Now let's make the acceptance criteria really clear. We're going to talk about it. A story is just a placeholder for a conversation. But in that conversation, we're going to be asking these questions. How do you know that you got what you asked for? And let's capture some of that so that, to remind you how you're going to accept this story. And then when it's delivered, and by the way, we also do acceptance all throughout. We don't wait until the end with a sprint demo. It's all the time. As soon as a story is delivered, product manager can accept it. And the product managers who are really, really good, I swear, I don't know if they've like synced up their smartwatches to Pivotal Tracker, which is what we use because we're Pivotal, so that they get alerted every time there's a story, but they will like accept a story within minutes of it being delivered, the ones who are really, really effective.